Hi, my name is David Hicks. Welcome to this series on getting to know Jesus. This is part 11. Don't worry if you haven't seen the other parts before. When I present these videos, I assume that either you haven't seen the previous ones or it's just been a long time since you've seen the previous ones. So I try and review key points as we go along, or sometimes I just start out with a review. And to do just that, to catch you up to speed, what we've been talking about is various aspects of Jesus' life, from his birth to his baptism and to a time with which someday I'll learn to speak English. During which he was tempted by Satan, his teachings, his miracles, and even why he was hated by many people. And so now we're ready to focus on Jesus' death, beginning with this lesson or this reading on how Jesus was arrested. So to give you a good screenshot of all the verses we're going to cover and what they're about, we're going to, well, I had to scoot way back. But we're going to start with Matthew 26, 1 through 16. Actually, we're going to start with John 12. We're going to read two accounts of the same story about how Mary was Lazarus' sister. Remember, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead after he was dead for 4 days. How she anoints Jesus. Then we're going to hit Matthew 26 and just stay there the rest of the time. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. John chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, that's a Jewish festival celebrating an event that happened when they were slaves in Egypt. I won't go into many details other than that. Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As a keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was meant that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. So here Mary, Lazarus' sister, takes this extremely expensive perfume. I mean, imagine, working a year at an average wage, taking your entire salary for the entire year, buying one thing and using it immediately. That's what Mary did, but she used this expensive perfume to anoint Jesus. Now, what moved her heart to do this, I don't know, but as far as Jesus was concerned, she was anointing him in preparation for his burial. Now, Judas Iscariot, did it say Judas Iscariot here? Please forgive me. Yes, was one of Jesus' 12 apostles. Of all his disciples, the ones who were trying to learn his teachings and incorporate them into his life, into their lives, Jesus chose 12 of them to be his apostles, his special messengers. The three most famous being Peter, James, and John, and I guess the fourth most famous being Judas Iscariot, because Judas did betray him. And notice that Judas wasn't objecting to what Mary was doing because he cared about the poor. He was the one who kept the money bag, probably volunteered to do it so he could dip his hand into it, because that's what he did on occasion. He would steal for the money that had been donated to them and use it for himself. Now, keep this in mind as we go to Matthew chapter 26. I'll duck down just for a second and begin at verse 1 and read Matthew's account of the same story. Matthew 26, I did mark it, beginning at verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. So here's the background to this story. It's the Passover is 2 days away. Jesus is telling his disciples the Son of Man is going to be crucified. Son of Man was an expression he often used to refer to himself. And so meanwhile, the chief priests and the elders of the people, two groups of people that Jesus largely criticized openly for their hypocrisy. If you didn't catch the series on the videos on why Jesus was hated by many, the bottom line to it was Jesus testified to the world that what the world was doing was evil. And so the people doing that evil didn't want to hear it, most of them. And instead of repenting, they hated Jesus in return and plotted to kill him. So they were trying to figure out how to do it because Jesus was so popular among the common people that the chief priests and the elders, they figured, if we try and do it in the middle of this feast, there's going to be a riot. We had to figure out some sneaky way to arrest him to where, the people don't grab us and stone us to death, so to speak. So that's the background to this story. Now, verse 6, while Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which he poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste? They asked. The perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. Now stop there for a second. Now, apparently there was more than just Judas objecting to what was this Mary was doing, but remember, Judas was one of the key objectors. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. I tell you the truth, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 silver coins. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So we see the same story. Matthew emphasizes that she put perfume on Jesus' head. John emphasizes that she put on some on his feet. That's not important. That's not really relevant. What's important here is that we see what Judas did afterward. Another couple of important things. One is Jesus talked about how what Mary had did to honor him would be told throughout the world wherever the gospel was preached. And lo and behold, this is what we're doing. Her story is in the scriptures. The scriptures all over the world. Wherever the gospel is preached, just like I'm doing in this very moment, I'm going over this story. I'm going over this beautiful act of kindness that Mary did for Jesus. So in what you're hearing right now, this is a fulfillment, one instance of a fulfillment of this very prophecy of Jesus about how what she did would be told in memory of her, wherever the gospel is preached. I'm doing it right now. So Judas, what does he do? He goes to the chief priest and he says, what would you give me? What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? And so they gave him 30 silver coins. Judas was mad that this perfume wasn't sold and the money, quote unquote, given to the poor. In other words, the money given to them so they could give it to the poor, because he wanted to steal the money. And he was so upset about this that right after this incident, he goes to the chief priest and says, basically, well, I'm going to get money one way or the other, and agrees to betray Jesus for 30 silver coins. Now, most of us have heard that money is the root of all evil. Technically, that's not correct. I put a little asterisk here, and at the very bottom, you see this verse. It's 1 Timothy 6:10. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. Money is great. You need to be wise with money, okay? It's a part of life. We need to be wise with it, but we should never trust it and never love it. Judas loved money. He loved it so much, he was willing to betray the Son of God to get it. Now, that is something, if we say nothing else, that's a wonderful thing to just stop, reflect on. Okay, what does money mean to me? Is it something I just have, I use, or is it something I love and I go after no matter who I hurt in the process? Now, in the next part of Matthew 26, Jesus spends time during the feast with his disciples. He does several things. He tells them that one of them was going to betray him, meaning Judas. Now, they didn't catch on at that moment that it was Judas, but later they understood that how Jesus had indicated that it was going to be Judas. He also began what was something called, I call the Lord's Supper around the world. It's referred to in many different names: communion, Eucharist. It's where Jesus gives bread to his disciples and tells them to eat it, because in remembrance of me, this bread is my body. He gives them wine to drink and says, drink it. This wine is my blood that is going to be shed for you. And then finally, he basically warns the disciples that they were all going to fall away because of him. They're all going to be offended, and that they were all going to abandon him, basically. And Peter is the most verbal in objecting this and saying, I will never betray you. I die for you, Jesus. And yet Jesus tells Peter, before the rooster crows, you're going to disown me 3 times. So all that happens, and then they leave the room where they were, they leave the room where they were having the feast, and they go to a garden. And so we're going to pick up there, the Garden of Gethsemane. This is Matthew 26, beginning of verse 36 through 45. Now, this story is also told in Luke 22, 39 through 46, and Mark as well. But there's a couple of things here that Luke includes. We're not going to read that. I'm just going to reference it in just a moment here. But let's read this. Matthew 26, beginning of verse 36. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour? He asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So Jesus goes to the garden. He has most of his disciples say in one place he does bring Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that's James and John that are mentioned earlier. Brings them with him a little bit farther. He was closer to them to the rest. Had them stay in a certain place, and he went a little farther into the garden. And he prayed intensely. Now Luke, in Luke 22 that I told you about, Luke mentions that during this time that Jesus poured out his heart to God, begging God for another way, that God sent an angel to Jesus to strengthen him. God's ultimate answer, as we will see, was, this is the only way. There's not another way. But he did what he could to try and strengthen Jesus so that he could make it through the trial that he was about to face. God didn't take the trial away, but he did try and strengthen Jesus to help him through it. And Luke also mentions that Jesus' sweat was like drops of blood. Now, I've heard some people speculate that Jesus was praying that you can be so intense that you can get blood mingled in your sweat. Maybe that's it. Personally, I just think that he was sweating so profusely that sweat was just dripping off his face like blood would drip off one's face. But regardless, you see, and this was a cold night. In other places, it's mentioned that, and it may be coming up. I haven't even looked at that yet. That Peter at one point is warming himself around a fire. It's a cold night. And yet Jesus was praying so intensely, he has sweat dripping off him like blood. He is in deep agony, deep trouble, deep sorrow. He is, from all I can tell here, partly worried, partly scared, and just not looking forward to, and who would be, to being tortured to death. So he begs God for another way, but he also says, God, not what I want, but what you want. Not my will, but yours. In the end, Jesus was saying, this is what I want, but in the end, it's not what I want, it's what you want. That's first and foremost what's most important. That's what I will do. And so after 3 intense prayers, and his disciples not praying with him, not staying awake, the poor, I wouldn't have done any better. I would have probably been one of the first ones to fall asleep. Finally Jesus, he's standing by himself, it feels like. And finally he says, wake up, my betrayer is at hand. All right, so let's move now to Matthew 26, 47 to 56. We're going to talk about the actual arrest of Jesus. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. Now Judas left the other disciples during the middle of the feast, when they were back in the room celebrating the Passover. During that time, Judas left to go get soldiers to arrest Jesus. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, Friend, do what you came for. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? At that time, Jesus said to the crowd, Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. So Judas arrives, and he gave the people with the swords and clubs a sign. Remember, this is not the days of television or cell phones where you can, here's a picture of Jesus. Oh, that's what he looks like. No, many of them would not have known what Jesus looked like. And so Judas gave them a sign, the one I kiss, that's the one you need to arrest. And in his greeting to Jesus, he kisses him, probably one of those side-to-side cheek things. Who cares? And so one of Jesus' companions, in one of the other Gospels, it tells a story and it mentions who it was. It was Peter. Peter grabbed a sword. He swings it at the high priest's servant, cuts off his ear, probably because the high priest did like this to duck out of the way. And so Peter got his ear because he wasn't going for just an ear. And then Jesus immediately rebukes him and tells him to put his sword in his place. Now, the thing I want you to see here, not only a couple of things I want you to see. But he said, put your sword back in its place. Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. That's verse 52. Now, some of you watch this video, you're probably very familiar with gun violence, gang violence. and maybe you're caught up in it yourself. But when you take guns and you use them against other people, you end up getting killed by guns. Those who use the sword, they get killed by the sword. That's not an always thing, but that's a general principle. And so I'd hope you'd see the wisdom of what Jesus is saying. And if you're caught up in that world, turn away from that world. Or if you know those who are in that world, that you'd encourage them to turn away from it and to abandon the violence that people do to one another through guns and whatever weapons you might think of. But the thing I really want you to see is what Jesus said in verse 53. Do you think I cannot now call my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Now, one of the key things here is that Jesus, to die for us, to take the punishment for our wrongdoings, he had to do it willingly. He had to, well, two things. One, he had to never do wrong himself. If he was going to save people who were sinners, he himself could not be a sinner, and he wasn't. He was tempted in all ways we're tempted, but he never sinned. That's checkbox one. Checkbox two is that this needed to be done willingly. Jesus could not be forced to die for us. That doesn't work. That is not. God's a God of justice, okay? And if someone's going to take our punishment, it has to be done willingly. It can't be forced, because that's not the loving sacrifice that would atone for our sins. And so Jesus had an out, okay? If Jesus wanted, all he had to do was to say the word, and God would send 12 armies of angels, basically, to free him and save him. Jesus did not have to do this. He had an out, but he chose to do it anyway, out of love for God, out of love for his Father, out of love for you and me. Verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Now, I'll stop there just to say that Jesus' words were, this was after he had cleared the temple out of people who were selling. They were selling animals. They were using God's temple as a money-making scheme. And so Jesus made a whip of cords and drove them out. He drove off the animals. He overturned the money changers' tables, and just he was hacked off at what they were doing to God's temple. And so when the people confronted Jesus on why he was doing what he was doing, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." And John says, this is in the Gospel of John, that he was talking about the temple of his body. You destroy this temple, in 3 days, it's going to be raised. So they've contorted what Jesus was saying here, and they were trying to say that Jesus was threatening to destroy the temple. All right, verse 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?" Now, to help you understand the scene, remember that the Jews were ruled by Rome at the time. The Jews couldn't just take somebody and put them to death. Although you read later on, after Jesus' death, they did that anyway. In Jesus' case, they had to figure out a reason to get the Romans to crucify him. They had to have a reason for them to put Jesus to death. And so they're searching for one. They bring all these false witnesses to come and lie about Jesus to try and come up with a good story, and no story fits. And so finally, and Jesus doesn't say anything. If you remember in Isaiah 53, it's a prophecy about Jesus and about his death. One of the things it talks about is, as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. While Jesus was on trial, he hardly ever said anything. No matter what false accusations were being brought against him, he didn't say anything. Just as Isaiah prophesied it would be. And part of the reason for that is, if Jesus had decided to defend himself, who would beat him? They've tried to trick Jesus before with question after question, and Jesus refuted them every time, easily. But he didn't defend himself, because he knew his mission was to die. So in the end, he confesses that he is God's son, and they accuse him of blasphemy, insulting God. And so they spit in his face. They strike him with their fists. In another gospel, it mentions another account of the story of Jesus, mentions they blindfolded him. And so they would slap him and say to him, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you? You're really a prophet? You really, you think you're so smart? Then tell us, who hit you?" And Jesus just took it. He was paying the price for our wrongdoings, for our failures, for our sins. And in our next video, we'll see how he continued to pay this price. In the rest of Matthew 26, I encourage you to read it. We ran out of time, really. But it's the story of how Peter, just like he said he would not do, he betrayed Jesus. And we may pick up there next time. We'll see. But he disowns Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows. And then when he realizes what he's done, he runs out and he weeps bitterly. And I will say this much about that story. We often judge people saying, well, if I were them and I was in that situation, I wouldn't do that. It's always easy to say what we would and would not do in a situation when we're not in the situation itself. But when we're under the gun, when we're in the heat of the battle, we often do things that we think we wouldn't do. I've been there. I've done that. And so I say that to remind us to be hesitant when it comes to judging others and what they do in certain situations and boasting and saying, I would never do something like that. Really? Have you been in that situation before? I'd be very careful to say that if I had not. All right, may this video be a blessing to you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening. God bless you, and God bless the world. And God, show me how to turn off this video.